Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, come back. Come back, Liz. There we go.
So we usually give people about five minutes. So
Yeah.
around 3:05, you can start, or if you want to give it a little bit longer, up to you. But we're supposed to have over 150 people on. So
Well, why don't you just give me a signal when you want it to start?
Right. And Jane, is that okay if I see some questions that I can I interrupt you at some point and ask the questions, or would you rather want me to wait and you'll give it some specific time? How
Well,
do you want
actually, I will be eternally grateful if people will interrupt me with questions.
All right, so I'm the only one who can interrupt.
Okay.
So I believe. Okay, so I will look into the chat and see if there are any questions, and then along the way I'll ask you those questions. Okay.
Great. It's totally up to you.
Okay. Okay.
Let me see. And Zach, so you're going to make Jane a host, right? Because if I leave, I don't want
yeah.
this
Well,
session to end.
if you leave, it's not gonna end. It's just
Yeah.
gonna pass it on to her. Yes.
I hope so. Okay, because you remember another meeting where the session ended abruptly. But I'm going to leave about 5 minutes to 5.
Oh, I hope I'm done by then.
Well, yeah, then there is no issue. So we have we have 24 people right now. 25 people. I don't know. What time is it?
It's 3:00. We just started.
Oh, it's
5
just
more
3
minutes. Give
o'clock.
it 5.
Yeah, okay, yeah, five more minutes. Okay.
So you guys keep on time, and then 3:05 you can start. No problem.
Okay. So to those who are present, I just want to make sure if you have any questions, just put it in the chat and I'll read them to Jane. Okay.
Okay, while we're waiting, I have a question, and that's it. This is a very popular topic. I mean, there have been movies, there were books, God knows there were books. There's all kinds of stuff about Mary and Elizabeth. So people really come to this with a great variety of input. And I wonder if I could ask the people that are already here if to tell me what their contact with this is. I mean, are they researchers? Are they totally naive to any Elizabeth or Mary? Have they seen a movie? Have they read a book? Anything.
Yeah, I guess you could put it in the chat. What is your interest and what do you know? How knowledgeable you are about this subject?
Oh, that's great. And maybe I could ask Greg to make a summary of what's in the chat rather than answering it one at a time if there's a bunch of them. Otherwise, one at a time.
Yeah, you probably see this from
No, I don't.
Okay, I'll read some of it while we're waiting.
Uh-huh.
A movie with Catherine Hepburn.
Oh, that was great.
Opera by Donizetti.
Yep.
and
Thea.
Thea Musgrave.
But the opera, there's two of them. There's Roberto Devereux, and then there's Anna Bolena. Well, Anna Bolena would be before she was born, but you certainly get the idea. Any more?
Opera, the opera she was talking about is Maria Stuarda.
Oh, Maria Stuarda. Okay.
All right. So Karen from Maryland saying, interested in the subject, remember seeing PBS Masterpiece Theater, production on her back in 70s. Also saw a recent movie with Margot Robbie as Elizabeth. Nicole M, the Tudors, with Charlton Rhys Myers, and the operas on the topic. Carolyn T. Cohen, hello from Carolyn in Tallahassee.
Well, I'm so glad there were so many music fans out there. I thought
Just
classical music was dying.
okay. Let's see what else. Let me let some people in. Oh, wait. All right. Okay, Opera Mar, Michael Kwan is saying. I know what that means.
No, I don't either. Okay, well, it's 3:05. So shall I start?
Yes, go ahead. And you know, from now on, I'll read questions if there are any along the way, so everyone knows that you could put your questions in the chat, and I will at some point ask Jane about it. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, welcome to a twofer talk because you're getting both Elizabeth and Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. They were cousins, by the way. I guess most of you know that. We will be revisiting a little bit of my talk on Catherine de' Medici because Mary Stuart was Catherine de' Medici's daughter-in-law. Of course, Mary was also the cousin of Queen Mary Tudor, fondly known as Bloody Mary. Some of my friends get Mary Tudor mixed up with Mary Stuart, so don't do that. By the way, Bloody Mary's husband, Philip II of Spain, was previously married to Mary Stuart's sister, Elizabeth, and before that, to Mary's sister-in-law, it should be, Elizabeth, and before that to Anna of Austria. I mentioned.
Jane, excuse me, somebody here asked if he could make the screen share full size. You probably could, it seems that it's.
I'm not sure I can. Let me see if I can do this here. Maybe this will do it. No, that gets it littler.
Yeah, it made, yeah, well.
Let's see about this one.
No,
it doesn't offer me that option. This is the best I can do, sorry. Okay. All right, I mentioned this to show how close were the ties among the ruling families of Europe. You know, we're used to thinking of countries, or we used to be, as entities that stayed neatly inside their borders. But in the late 16th century, rulers and their countries were completely interlocked by marriage and other kinship ties. You might think of them as a bunch of early globalists. Engagements took place in infancy. Marriages were solemnized in childhood and consummated frequently in what we would call childhood again. 12 years old, 14 years old, etc. You know, that pretty much rules out love as a motive. It was alliances and territorial gains that were in play. Now, let's take a look at the first slide, which is the Tudor family tree. And we have Arthur. Arthur was Henry's brother, and he was married to Catherine of Aragon. Arthur died early on, and Henry married Catherine of Aragon, which is a kind of questionable thing, and I'm not quite sure he got a dispensation. But the marriage produced a child, a living child, which was very rare for Henry, but he didn't know it yet. And that was Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary. Now, he was the son of...
What's going on here? Let me see. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm
okay.
muted.
All right. Henry himself was the son of Henry VII. He was Henry VIII. And alongside Henry, his sister was Margaret. Margaret married James IV of Scotland and gave rise to James V, whose daughter was Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots. Then we also have on the side another relative, Mary, who gave rise ultimately to poor little Lady Jane Grey, and we'll come to that later on. Now, to continue, we'll take a look at Mary Queen of Scots' coat of arms. And you'll see here, I've stretched it a bit, but this is a lion rampant, and that's the sign of Scotland. And here is the thing that probably cost her her life, which was that she quartered the arms of England, these three little lions, and they have names, by the way, that's Rollo and Maine and Aquitaine. And that showed her succession to the English crown. And, well, Elizabeth was kind of upset about that. While Elizabeth lived, Mary was a heartbeat or maybe a dagger stab away from the English throne. Henry VIII had 6 wives. The mnemonic is divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. We're not really used having to go into the last 3, but we do have to take a look at the first 3, because Mary Tudor's mother was the one who was divorced. Anne Boleyn, as we all know, was beheaded and haunts, I believe, the Tower to this day. Jane Seymour died, probably relative to childbirth, giving birth to Edward VI, who was the heir, since being male, of Henry. Especially since Mary and Elizabeth were both declared illegitimate in their time. I mean, Mary Tudor's mother had been divorced because he had wakened up one day to the fact that his wife was, the marriage was not right because his wife had been his brother's wife. And so that was bad according to the church. It knocked out Bloody Mary, and Elizabeth's Mary had been beheaded for adultery, so her paternity was suspect. Edward VI was sickly, and he died at 15, so Mary's chance for the English throne was not that bad. And it would have been a slam dunk if the rough wooing, which we will discuss shortly, had succeeded.
Jane, someone commented if you do Control-Z, your picture kind of shifted and you could center it, either just move it like, oh yeah, that's good.
There we go. Okay, I think we're done with that anyway. He wanted his bloodline on the throne, and Edward was dead, and there was Mary, and he didn't want her on the throne, so he restored them to legitimacy, which is a good trick. And in the end, Mary Stuart's son, James VI of Scotland, was put on the English throne. Meanwhile, things were going on in Europe. It was convulsing in the Reformation. Now, just to give you some dates of that, Elizabeth was born in 33. Mary was born in 42. And the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre that turbocharged the French wars of religion took place in 1572. Henry VIII declared himself the head of the church by the Act of Supremacy in 1574, and that transition was far from peaceful. Both Catholics and all varieties of Protestants in Flanders and the Netherlands chafed under Spanish rule, to put it mildly. Calvin preached from Geneva in 1536 until his death in 1564. In Spain, the Inquisition was in full swing. Recent estimates of those who were executed have been lowered. Only a few thousand burned, although over 100,000 were said to have died in prison of torture and other maltreatment. Although Mary was a staunch Catholic, her son, baptized in the Catholic faith, was raised in her absence as a Presbyterian. We're talking about Mary Stuart now. He leaned Anglican when he became titular head of the English Church. It's almost impossible to find a neutral account of Mary's Queen of Scots. She has her convinced partisans, those who see her eligible for sainthood for her adherence to the Catholic faith in the face of imprisonment and death. And those on the other side are totally convinced she was an immoral she-devil, constantly fomenting plots to take the English throne. This faction passionately supports Elizabeth and will hear no evil of her. It's not only a religious thing, though for some that's all important. People really like simple stories of heroes and opposing villains, even though the world really isn't that way. But Mary and Elizabeth would seem to be ideal candidates for those roles. It makes research very difficult because there is so much distortion of fact and the interpretation thereof. If you've read any of Mary's biographies or historical novels about Elizabeth, you may have a very different perspective than the one I present. But please feel free to chime in the chat. That's what makes history fun. In fact, both of these women were obsessed with staying in power and staying alive, because to do so meant negotiating tricky paths through foreign and domestic alliances with the leaders of countries that shared their religion, and sometimes not, and the rebels in countries that didn't. It was a complicated game they both played because they had no choice. In the end, Elizabeth won and Mary was defeated. Mary trusted the wrong people, including Elizabeth, and Elizabeth trusted nobody. We start this history, we could start it anywhere, but let's begin with survived, the first one. Her name was Catherine Parr. Henry, though getting on in years, needed a new wife. She should be pretty, but not flighty like the first Anne. Elizabeth's mother beheaded number one, or Catherine Howard beheaded number two. He settled on Catherine Parr, an elder lady of 31. He was to live only another 3.5 years. Not long after Henry's death, we come to Elizabeth's first major scandal. Elizabeth had grown very close to Queen Catherine, who was, after all, her stepmother. And when 3 months after Henry died, Catherine married Thomas Seymour, which was the brother of Jane Seymour, and part of a very ambitious family. Elizabeth naturally came to live with Catherine and Thomas, along with her beloved servants, Cat Ashley and Thomas Parry. Thomas Seymour had made a brief attempt to marry Elizabeth when she was 14, but that was 3 years before. So Catherine, even if she knew of it, probably thought it was unimportant. The menage a trois ended suddenly when Catherine walked in on Elizabeth and Thomas embracing. Catherine died in childbirth the following year. Thomas renewed his pursuit of Elizabeth, but initiating the pattern she would follow throughout her life. She was apparently quite responsive, but excused herself from commitment on the grounds that the consent of the council during Edward's minority was required for her marriage. She used other excuses later on. The sickly Edward was now king, and Thomas's brother, Edward Seymour, had been appointed protector, and therefore the most powerful man in England. Thomas bribed the kid with coins and candy, which was not a bad investment, since the young king made him first Baron of Dudley, along with the title of king, a modest residence, and I think I have it here. Yes. Yes, this is Dudley, and there's our first Baron, Thomas, who should enjoy it while he still can. When Edward Seymour left London to lead a raid on Scotland, Thomas made his move. Sure of the child's loyalty, he broke into the palace one night and got as far as the king's bedroom door, where one of the king's spaniels began to bark. Now, I'm sure everybody was used to a dog occasionally barking from time to time, but rather stupidly, Thomas picked up his gun and shot the dog, and thus alerted the whole household. He was taken prisoner and under examination revealed that he tried to recruit participants, including pirates, in a rising, probably to be held in support of the king against his protector, Edward Seymour, who would naturally be replaced by Thomas. Along with Thomas Seymour, all of his associates were arrested. Elizabeth was interrogated for weeks by a special prosecutor dedicated to her alone. In fact, she may not have known anything, since Thomas once embarked on a kidnap plus rebellion path and most likely relegated marriage to her. And she might never be queen after all, to Plan B status. The prosecutor swore she was guilty. He could read it in her face. But the only thing to emerge from the interrogation was a pattern of rough and tumble between the teenaged Elizabeth and her stepfather, Thomas, which today we would label child sexual abuse. He, dressed only in a nightshirt, would wake her up by tickling her. On one occasion, he ripped her dress to shreds, supposedly in fun, while she was in it. Catherine had occasionally joined this play before she realized what was actually afoot. Thomas was executed. King Edward now took a new best friend forever, or at least until execution might them part. The new pal was John Dudley, whose niece, Lady Jane Grey, was, like Mary Queen of Scots, a granddaughter of Henry VII, as we saw. There was one vital difference, though. Jane was a Protestant. Dudley influenced the king, now in his final illness, to issue a decree declaring both Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate again, and conferring the succession on 15-year-old Lady Jane. The decree went against Henry's testament, but nevertheless, on Edward's death, Jane became queen for a whole 9 days. Dudley was unpopular, as he was seen as the champion of nobles' rights, and also for land enclosures that victimized the peasantries who were trying to farm there. Catholic or not, the people supported Mary Tudor, who easily raised a force of 20,000 and marched on London. Probably it was sheep raising, not farming. Anyway, as soon as Dudley left London to take the field, the council declared for Mary. Dudley, along with Lady Jane and her husband, were arrested and beheaded. And here we have the poor kid getting the chop. By the way, I see I forgot to show this one. So if you're curious about the wives, there, here we are, the divorced, the beheaded, the died and survived. So let us go on. And now Mary Tudor became queen. Of course, the overriding question now was, whom would Mary marry? There was one suitor in particular who appealed to her, Prince Philip of Spain, the son and heir of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful monarch in the world. We are now including the Americas, the extorted wealth which was still pouring into Spain, except when the English got it by piracy. He was 26 at the time and already buried 2 wives. They died of natural causes, I hope. And she was a virgin of 37. But as I said, what's love got to do with it? That triggered Elizabeth's second scandal. The prospect of Philip as a royal consort was too much for many nobles, especially those who had profited from the confiscation of church property, which would go right back to the church with a Catholic monarch. Philip would be co-ruler, and a strong Catholic male in that position might easily demand that exact thing. Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion, the stated aim of which was to depose Mary and put Elizabeth on the throne. And also marry her off to a Protestant Englishman. Good idea. In fact, they had one already picked out, Edward Courtenay, a Protestant of royal blood, who wooed her after Mary's betrothal to Philip was announced. The rebellion was scotched, but a letter was found from Wyatt to Elizabeth about it. She didn't answer the letter. At least they hadn't found an answer, but she hadn't told anybody about it either. She was arrested and ferried to the same Traitor's Gate that in the Tower of London through which her mother had passed on her way to imprisonment and death. Elizabeth sat on the ground outside it in the rain, sobbing, and refused to go through. And I think we have a picture that I took of Traitor's Gate. And here is the Tower of London, which of course, as you see, it's all surrounded by green stuff and not by souvenir stands. And it's actually an artist's reproduction from the 1300s, which is 300 years before what we're talking about. So maybe there were a few souvenir stands then. And here is the Traitor's Gate, and it's right in this area where boats would come up, and it's very forbidding, and you know what's behind it. It's not the easy way in. Once again, she was interrogated, but no matter how hard they tried, and they did try, they couldn't find anything incriminating enough. Philip counseled Mary, who might have killed her on, anyway, that Elizabeth's death would inflame the country and become an insurmountable barrier to their marriage. And Mary was terrified that their marriage might be threatened. She was actually in love with him. Can you imagine? After 2 months, Elizabeth was released to house arrest at Woodstock. Courtenay was banished, where he died. During her sister's 5 years reign, half-sister, Elizabeth mostly concentrated on not getting burned at the stake for her beliefs, as 300 Protestants did. Henry had executed but not burned Catholics, all 30 of them for protesting his self-appointment to head of the church, the English church. Elizabeth had to play a double game. As the best hope of the Protestant and anti-Spanish party, particularly after Mary's marriage, she could not appear too sympathetic to Mary's unbending Catholicism. On the other hand, she needed to placate her sister by hearing an occasional mass, especially after Philip realized, after 2 false pregnancies, that his dying wife would never bear a child. Ever practical, Philip began paying court quite discreetly to Elizabeth. He may actually have been kind of in love with her. He did protect her many times while Mary was alive. Or maybe it was simply a prudent policy. Elizabeth put him off as usual. And it was pretty easy because he spent as little time as possible in England. Mary Tudor was devastated by his neglect, by the way. She died November 12, 1558, as were the custom riders were on their way to her residence, Hatfield House, before the body cooled. When Elizabeth heard their news, these were the words she spoke. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." And then she broke down and cried. And this is a good break. If anybody has questions, I would like to hear them, or comments, or whatever.
So far, no questions, but
Oh.
maybe, yeah. So Mary Tudor, was she married to anyone?
Yes. Yeah, she was married to Philip of Spain, but he didn't visit very often. He wanted an heir to the British,
Right.
to the English throne. And that would have, he
The
was,
Catholic, because
yes,
that's the
was
main
he-
problem.
yeah, is the King of Spain Catholic? Yes. Anyhow, yeah, she was married to him. And that was, of course, a problem. Very few people, I think, even the Catholic faction in England were comfortable in that. I mean, they could accept Mary being Catholic, but having a Spanish person Catholic was beyond. It wasn't that they were prejudiced against Spaniards, they just didn't want to get invaded. Okay.
Yeah, but she was a daughter of his sister, right? No, Philip II. Oh no, it was
Wait,
Philip
who are we-
II. Mary Tudor, wasn't she his relative? She was pretty close relative, right? She's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, right?
Yes.
And Philip, a grandson of Isabel, right?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure of that. If you say so, sure.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I think he is. Yeah, Philip II. Yeah. Oh no. Philip II. Yeah, he is the son of
Charles V.
Charles V. Charles V was the grandson of Isabel, so he was a great grandson. Okay,
Yeah,
that's right.
that sounds more like it.
Yeah.
Charles V was the big guy, you know. He's the powerful one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why do they call Mary Tudor Bloody Mary?
It may have something to do with the 300 Protestants she had executed.
Okay, that's for the benefit of those who may be interested. The drink Bloody Mary goes after Mary Tudor and her prosecution of Protestants.
Good heavens, I thought it was just tomato juice.
All right.
Okay, so let's continue a little bit. And we come to Elizabeth in 1559. She was crowned finally Queen of England on January 15th, 1559. So we've been a long time without a scandal for her, and it was a doozy. Elizabeth was now under great pressure to marry and conceive an heir. However, after the long, rocky road to power, it was not likely that she was going to relinquish it to a spouse, even if his role was only that of king consort rather than king. A consort would be capable, simply by being male, of gathering the support of the council and the nobles, particularly if he had his own power base. And anybody important enough or of sufficient rank to be considered would obviously have that. And what were Elizabeth's remembrance of royal marriages that she'd observed? Beheading, betrayal, neglect, and death in childbirth. Well, enter Robert Dudley. Robert had been a playmate of hers way back in childhood. He'd shared her imprisonment in the Tower because his father was John Dudley of the Lady Jane fiasco. And he very nearly had been executed. Besides, he was kind of cute. In fact, Here he is. Yes, I will agree with that. Okay. Upon her accession to the throne, Elizabeth immediately installed Dudley at court as master of the horse. This really sounds medial, like he has to clean out the stables, but it didn't mean that. In practice, it meant that he went hunting with her. Oh, how did we do this? In practice, it meant he went hunting with her, and also that he would have to confer about the next day's program, which they generally did in a bedroom after night had fallen. Now, what happened was that he had one impediment to marrying her. And that was because she actually thought about it. And that was, by the way, here is a slide of Elizabeth as a young girl, just about the time she was crowned. She made him an Earl of Leicester, and we're going to call him Leicester from now on in. And that gave him the rank to actually be her spouse, but he did have a wife. He came to court without the wife. She was left in this really creepy house about 5 miles out of Oxford, and it really does look creepy. And one day, shortly after he came to court, she was found dead at the bottom of a flight of stairs. It had been theorized that she was depressed over an illness as well as her husband's conduct. Still, throwing yourself down the stairs is questionable as an efficacious means of death, because this picture is pretty much accurate. There were only 12 steps with a landing in the middle. However, the house was 3 stories tall, so self-defenestration would have been much more reliable. There was an inquiry, and the coroner's jury, the autopsy was lost until 2008, made no conclusion. But they did find 2 dints in her head, one quite deep. Of course, the jury had been chosen by Robert Dudley's good friend, Thomas Blount. Elizabeth somehow didn't marry Dudley, but she did offer him to her dear cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. We haven't said much about Mary up to now, but we will in a minute. I should mention, of course, that the Spanish ambassador sent a letter 2 days before Amy's death, and the letter said that Elizabeth and Leicester had been overheard discussing the killing of Amy. Now, of course, if you're planning on killing somebody, you're just not going to hang out and do this right in front of the Spanish ambassador or anybody from Spain or anybody from England, as a matter of fact. However, it was part of the job of the Spanish ambassador to insert a spy or buy a spy in Elizabeth's bedroom, and I guess that's exactly what happened. You can take your own view on this. And now, are there any questions yet? Still no?
No, I don't see any questions.
I wish people were more courageous. Okay, Mary departed Scotland for France in 1548, the year of Catherine Parr's demise. She was 5 years old and ready to become French royalty. The child was beautiful. She was intelligent. She was athletic. She was studying languages. She delighted everybody, including her spouse to be, and the marriage was celebrated in 1558, the year of Mary Tudor's death. The wedding's consummation was observed by the father of the groom, because in those days you had to do that so that no impediment to making heirs must be found. And he reported that they both jousted well. And so let's see if we can find a good slide of Mary and Francois. Remember, I think they were both 15 years of age at this point. Francois was really kind of sickly. We'll get to that. He had terrible headaches. They might have been migraines. There might have been a brain tumor, all things considered. And people think he might have had TB, but nobody knows for sure in these things. And people always make armchair diagnoses, so don't put too much faith in that. Anyhow, Henri II of France reported that they both jousted well. And he should have lived many years beyond this, Henri II, of course. However, he was vain of his prowess at the just, the kind that you hold in tournaments, and insisted on one last ride at the games held in 1559 to mark the disastrous, well, for France anyway, Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis. The joust was no less disastrous for Henri. His opponent's lance shattered and a fragment pierced his eye. What had happened?
Jane,
Yeah.
someone is asking if you could type or repeat the names of the people on the picture, because they didn't catch it. It's hard to sometimes to hear.
Here's Mary, Queen of Scots, and now Queen of France, as you can see from the crown. And there's her new 15-year-old also husband, Francois, who would be deuxième, and the second, and those are the names. Okay.
So I can imagine she is married to a child, basically. It's quite, but from what I understand, her life at the French court wasn't so bad.
Well, we'll get to the Guise faction shortly, and we'll get to Catherine. And her life at the French court was pretty good until, and then it got pretty awful. As long as Francois was alive, she was okay.
Right. Yeah, but she was there even before, right? Before they got married, she was staying there.
She was married to him when she was
yeah, but I know, but even before, even before they got married, she was still living there, right, at the court.
Oh yes, she came to Scotland with her 4 Marys and Bothwell, as a matter of fact, and she was living there. I mean, they wanted her to grow up speaking French fluently and totally Frenchified, and she needed to be there. Now, also, there was something going on in England at the time called the rough wooing. It was going on at the Scots border. So that was making things a little hot for her too. So all in all, it was good policy. And she had regents, and certainly the regents were in a better position to govern than she was. And they certainly couldn't ask her advice at 6 years old, excuse me. So anyhow, what had happened to Henri, this is advice for anybody who wants to go jousting. The person who contacts you with a lance is supposed to immediately drop the lance so you won't be injured. It's supposed to be a game, right? But the guy who hit Henri in the eye didn't. And that's why he died. Okay. Now, there was a faction in France. We mentioned that France was split. There were the Huguenots, the Protestants, and there were the Catholics, and they hated each other. Mary's mother was Mary of Guise, who had married James V. Mary of Guise was, I believe, the sister of Francois of Guise, who the Guises had come from relatively minor nobility. But Francois had been a major military hero. He'd gotten himself scarred. He was known as the Balafré, and he had real hero status. And his brother was the Cardinal of Lorraine and was very, very prominent in the church. And they pretty much ran the Catholic fashion. Now, Catherine de' Medici at least started out trying to preserve peace between the Catholics and the Protestants. She gave up after a while, but at this point, she was still trying. Now, the Guises were ecstatic because now they actually had a real live Guise with the crown of France on her head. And so what it worked out was they would tell Mary, tell Francois, we think it's very advisable that he do thus and so. And she would do so. And Francois, who was head over heels in love with her, would do it. And meanwhile, Catherine, who was no longer regent, she was Queen Dowager. And that doesn't count for all that much. And she was simply pushed out of the way. And the people close to her were sent abroad, and they found things for them to do somewhere else in the world. And so she was alone, and she was pushed to the side. And she fumed. I mean, she fumed, but she was helpless. Mary was inevitably going to be pregnant, and a male heir would considerably lessen the chance that any of her other three sons would become king and restore her power. But Francois' health was, as I said, poor. He had migraines and possibly tuberculosis. Illness frequently confined him to bed, and 2 years after the wedding, he developed an abscessed ear. Now, with all of that, and Mary being as young as she was, there was no pregnancy. The infection, Francois' infection, the urine infection spread to the brain, as they sometimes do. The Guises were terrified that he would die, and their dream of absolute power. And they called in Ambroise Paré, who was a renowned specialist in the treatment of infections. He made his reputation by actually saving lives on the battlefield. But Catherine refused to let him see Francois. As his mother, that was the only power she still retained. She sat there beside his bed and listened to his screams for days until he died. Catherine's son, Charles, was now Charles IX, the king. Okay, that is now a break point. And any questions? Greg, are you still there?
Yes,
Maybe.
I'm here. Yeah, I'm here. Somebody asked, did you say Catherine of Aragon married again? Yeah, no, she didn't marry again, but I guess.
Catherine was officially, good question. Catherine, it's all confusing. Everybody's either named Catherine or Mary at this point. Catherine of Aragon had been married to Arthur, who was the brother of Henry VIII. Arthur died in childhood. He never came to the throne. And somehow Henry married Catherine in a levirate marriage, probably because they wanted to retain the alliance between Spain and England. And because it was a levirate marriage, Henry, at a certain point, a little after he met Anne Boleyn, decided that the marriage was illegal, illegitimate, whatever they call it. And he applied for a divorce. And that is another story, which I don't want to get into right now. Okay.
Let me see. Somebody says, was she the youngest queen that we know of at 6? I guess it's about Mary uh,
Oh,
was
Mary
was
Queen of Scots?
I guess, yeah.
Well, no, she was engaged. She was married at 6 years old and became Queen of France at 6 years old. But Mary, the same Mary, was queen when her father, James V, died, and she was 6 days old.
So she was 6 years old. She was a queen of Scotland, or queen of at 6,
At 6, she was married to the
Francis.
to Francois, but she wasn't queen yet. She wasn't. Correct me. She was queen when she married, which was 15.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But of Scotland at 6 days old. Precocious.
Right.
Okay.
Another, this is just a comment, okay, from Beverly. When creating presentation, it's helpful for attendees to read brief facts to accompany photos, maps, and so on, hard to rely strictly on sense of hearing. It's just a general comments.
Okay.
I assume nobody can read the comments except me, so I'm just relating it. Okay.
Okay. Maps, I thought about it, but in fact, we don't really tremendously need maps because we're not dealing with wars. We're dealing with basically Scotland and England, and the border between Scotland is about the only important geographical landmark that we have, and people kind of know where that is, and Hadrian's Wall and all that. And as far as France, as far as most of the action is concerned, it took place in or near various palaces. So, I could put a map of the various places on the Loire where conspiracy things were hatched, or
No, I don't think it's necessary, Jane. Just continue with the presentation.
Okay. All right. So we have Mary's reign. And essentially, we left Mary Elizabeth, Queen of England, happily cuddling with Robert Dudley, and her rival to be Mary Stuart, widowed, and the mercy of her mother-in-law. Catherine pretty much despised Mary for turning her son away from her and towards the brothers' Guise. Mary's own mother, the widowed Queen of Scotland, Mary of Guise, had expired 6 months before the death of Francois. Our Mary had been officially Queen of Scotland since the death of her father in 1542, but her mother had acted as regent for most of the interim. Now that she was dead, Mary would either have to act as queen in Scotland or appoint another regent. But why would she? Catherine was ecstatic to rid herself of Mary, and the Guise family were happy to have her on a throne, any throne, where she could be useful. So Mary was put on a ship for Scotland, along with the four Marys who kept with her again, Beaton, Seton, Fleming, and Livingston, who had been her companions from before she even left Scotland. Her extensive baggage was brought over by the Lord High Admiral, one James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell, and he will emerge importantly later on.
Jane, can I interrupt? There is another question. It's a little bit off the topic because it's and I don't quite understand. It's asked, so who was the stepfather of abused Elizabeth? I don't know who, a stepfather who abused Elizabeth.
Thomas Seymour. He was he married the widow of Henry VIII. And of course, the widow was her stepmother, Elizabeth's stepmother.
Right. So he became her stepfather, even though she's not related to any of them, but it's she had a stepmother and stepfather. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, that's how it goes. Here I have a question. Do you think that all of this contests that existed between Mary and Elizabeth are really about a lot about religion, a lot about Catholic, because the Guises were Catholic, right?
Yes, they ran the
and they
Catholic
wanted,
League.
yeah, and they wanted to put a Catholic queen on an English throne, right? That's my understanding. I mean, you're probably
Yes.
more familiar with it. And Elizabeth, of course, was Protestant, and so I think all of these forces, political players, they kind of like, was, I believe, a lot about this religious split.
And that was the main thing. But let us not forget that if Elizabeth were to be assassinated, Mary stood to gain the throne. And there were a bunch of plots over time that wanted to put Mary on the throne. Okay, they wanted to put her on the throne because she was Catholic, not because she would have been a competent ruler, far from it. But anyhow, that was also a feature of what went on.
And some people say that she had a better claim to the English throne than Elizabeth, because the divorce with Catherine of Aragon was not recognized by Pope.
Well, that was
Kind of.
Mary to Anne Boleyn.
No, yeah, and Boleyn, I'm talking about the divorce with Catherine Aragon, meaning that the marriage to Anne Boleyn was not
Yes,
really a legitimate kind of in the eyes of Catholics, because Pope didn't approve it.
I think they kind of gave up on that because if they liked being Catholic, but they also liked being English. And so the idea that the nearest Catholic person on the throne, other than Mary Tudor or Mary Stuart, would be Philip II of France, gave people pause because they really didn't want that.
Yeah, because he is completely foreign. He's Spanish, but Mary Stuart is kind of, well, a neighbor.
Yeah. She's next door, and
Yeah.
her son got there anyway.
Right. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. All right. So, of course, the moment Mary's silken shoe touched Scottish soil, the inevitable question raised again: who would Mary marry? The question had actually arisen before her marriage at 5 years old. It was called the Rough Wooing, and it was initiated by Henry VIII on behalf of his 6-year-old son, Edward, in Mary's first year of life. England and Scotland had been in a chronic state of military activity around the borderlands. One Scots historian described English warfare this way: their policy was simply to pulverize Scotland, to beat her either into acquiescence or out of existence, and their campaigns resembled nothing so much as a Nazi reign of terror. North of the borderlands, the nobles of Scotland were split, some Catholic, some Protestant, most Protestant, I think, at this point. And there were martyrs there as well as in England, but I haven't got the count. Scotland is very far from Rome. The Romans, of course, never had a chance to build the kind of infrastructure they left in England. They were happy with a couple of walls to keep the Scots away. And so travel in the Highlands, even by car, even a few decades ago when I tried, is incredibly time-consuming for a place that takes up so little space on the map. The clergy had been left to their own devices with little or no oversight, and the results were almost universally bad. We're talking about the old clergy. The common people were fed up with the high living of the highborn clergy, some of whom had illegitimate sons who were given appointments to lucrative ecclesiastical offices. The parish priests were notorious for ignorance and corruption. Even the king, James V, made a good thing out of the church. He was nominally Catholic, but profiting from the religion didn't keep him up at night. After he died, following Scotland's disastrous defeat at the Battle of Solway Moss, his widow, Miss Mary of Guise, was even more securely tied to and dependent on France. Hostilities were supposed to end. Indeed, the Scots could not have continued fighting after the Solway Moss disaster. With the Treaty of Greenwich in 1543, the treaty called for the marriage of baby Mary to Henry's son Edward. The Council of Scotland refused to ratify the treaty. I guess that's what you were talking about, Greg. So the war, since they didn't ratify it, didn't really go through, continued after Henry died in 1547. It didn't end until 1549, when the worsening English economy made continuing war too expensive. By that time, Mary was in France. She came home to a different Scotland than the one she had left. Her illegitimate half-brother, James, Earl of Moray, he's also known as Murray, but I remember him as Moray. It's an easy mnemonic because you think of Moray eel, it's spelled that way, and he kind of was like that. He had been regent and was the real power in Scotland. Another dominant figure was John Knox, who was head of the Protestant Lords of the Congregation, a fiery preacher who raged against Catholicism and particularly hated Mary. Moray and Knox wanted her to marry a Protestant, but Mary resisted. One possibility she explored was that of Don Carlo, the son of Philip II of Spain. But the boy had both mental and physical disabilities, and he liked to torture little animals, and he beat his dwarves. He was much nicer than the Verdi opera. And I know you're out there, so you can remember that. However, being Queen of Spain makes up for much. Catherine the Great would have snapped at it. Elizabeth had an easy answer. Mary could marry Robert Dudley. Excuse me? That was her squeeze. How could Elizabeth even think? Of course, he'd be a very useful spy, and he may have already put paid to one wife. Just saying. However, Dudley was not yet an earl. He was a Protestant, and even after he was elevated to appropriate stature, Mary was not about to poke into that particular snake den. Besides, she had a handsome and much younger dude. Let's catch up. Here we have James, Earl of Moray, and there we have John Knox, looking fearsome, which he was. And over here, we have a younger dude on offer, Henry Darnley. Now, Darnley was heir to the Earl of Lennox, a Catholic laird. So he would be an earl in due time. That made him eligible. His family was connected to the Guises, believe it or not, and he was, of course, Catholic. Occasionally, he was persuaded a little Knoxward, but he wavered. He always came back. He shared his maternal grandmother, Margaret Tudor, with Mary, which made them cousins, but that was usually dealt with, especially since the connection gave him a place in the English succession of his very own. The Guises were all in favor, since both Scottish monarchs would have Guise family connections, and Mary fell deeply in lust with the young man. Anything that the Guises liked, the Earl of Moray didn't. It's not as if she wasn't warned. Elizabeth's envoy, Melville, reported to Elizabeth that no woman of spirit would make a choice of such a man, Darnley, that was more like a woman of a man, for he was very lusty, though beardless and baby-faced. Whether this comment applied to his sexual orientation or only his appearance or both is not clear. Mary apparently didn't care, and the couple was joined in holy matrimony at Holyrood Abbey on July 29th, 1565, 4 years after Mary's arrival in Scotland. Mary, as a widow, wore black for the ceremony and changed afterwards to a festive jeweled gown. The powerful Earl of Moray immediately raised a rebellion at the presumed Catholic threat. The abbey itself, by the way, was destroyed in a later burst of anti-Catholic fervor. One of the souvenirs that was taken by the rioters was Darnley's head. They did that. Darnley was extremely fond of both alcohol and power. He had been created Duke of Albany in order to make him eligible to marry the Queen, but that wasn't enough. From the first bite of wedding cake, he pestered Mary to give him what's called the crown matrimonial, which would have made him king had he survived her. When she did not, he maltreated her, drinking with his friends according to gossip, seducing them, and certainly neglected her. And there were violent scenes. The worst of these violent scenes involved Mary's Italian secretary and musician, by the way, David Rizzio, whom Darnley suspected of impropriety, or at least he said so with her. Rizzio was kind of middle-aged to above, and I think I have a picture of him. Let me see. But you know, when you're in that kind of marriage, some people take the comfort where they can find it. This is probably a little on the flattering side. Okay, there were Darnley, together with a bunch of his friends, broke into Mary's study on the night of March 9th, 1556, a little bit more than 5 months after the wedding, and they stabbed Rizzio 56 times while either holding her at gunpoint or locking her in an adjoining room from which you could hear the screams. As usual, accounts vary. Rizzio, of course, didn't survive. Mary escaped to Dunbar Castle 2 days later, and Darnley followed her, and she forgave, or at least it seemed so. The last 3 months of Mary's pregnancy were devoid of drama. Mary delivered her son, the future James I of England and 6th of Scotland, on June 19th, 1566. Darnley was certainly less thrilled with this because now his chance at the throne, if the kid lived, was significantly less. He may also have suspected, or at least could gossip, that the baby was Rizzio, and it might have been. Aside from Mary's frustration with the treatment Darnley was meting out to her, Rizzio was stabbed just about the time Mary's pregnancy would have been starting to show. After the murder, Darnley's day-to-day behavior got worse, although he did refrain from murdering anybody else important. He probably congratulated himself on showing Mary who was the boss. Mary Stuart was not the first woman to repent of marrying a drunk, but she had more resources than most of her sisters in misfortune. One of the resources was an old friend we've mentioned from her days in France, James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. And I know I have a picture of him. Well, he looks kind of sneaky, but then maybe it was done after people knew a little more about him. Mary's husband, King Francois, had made him a gentleman of the bedchamber, and Mary had given him a grant of money. And now it was time to call in the marker. Bothwell was a ne'er-do-well who had rather informally married a Danish girl, stripped her of her fortune, and sent her back pregnant to her family in Denmark. This will become important, by the way. This was his second trip to Scotland. He had first visited with King Henry II of France to help Mary Stuart's mother, Mary of Guise, put down a rebellion of her Protestant nobles, although he himself was Presbyterian. One of his exploits for Mary's mother had involved hijacking a shipment of 3,000 pounds in silver sent by Elizabeth to help the rebels. She did that. In 1560, he accompanied Mary when she returned to Scotland, and now back the other way. It didn't take him long to get into trouble. In 1562, Moray, who detested Bothwell, accused him of treason and had him imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle. Bothwell escaped. He was good at that, back to France. From this safe perch, he petitioned Mary to let him back. She was now queen and beginning to assert her power. She repatriated him and made him lord of the borderlands for good measure. He repaid her by putting down Mary's rebellion that we talked about, and no doubt it was a labor of pure love. Meanwhile, Darnley got worse, or rather his behavior got worse. Mary was frequently in tears. She no longer had Rizzio to console her, and she found help in Bothwell. What help he gave her is ardently disputed. What is known is that on February 9th, 1567, while Mary attended a state dinner at home in Holyrood Palace, Darnley was in bed, supposedly recuperating from a contagious illness in a residence he maintained nearby called Kirk of Field. One of the apologetic biographies of Mary, Queen of Scots, claimed that she was staying overnight in Kirk of Field on the important night and other nights. Others simply deny this. So you can take your choice. Anyhow, if she was staying overnight that night, she was one lucky girl. On February 9th, 1567, while Mary attended a state dinner at home in Holyrood Palace, Darnley was in bed, supposedly recuperating. The house exploded at 2 a.m. on February 10th. This is a sketch of the results made from the ever alert William Cecil, who was Elizabeth's chancellor, and you know how many spies there were in Scotland. Okay, Darnley's body is lying at upper right. The other body was that of Darnley's servant, and they both look pretty good for having just had a house explode around them, but maybe the artist wanted to spare us of the grisly details. I doubt that somehow. Both had been asphyxiated, but you shouldn't read too much into that because the gases from a gunpowder explosion can do that, apparently. The house was gone down to the foundation. Somehow, an awful lot of gunpowder had found its way into the cellar. Now, there are perfectly good explanations for that. Maybe Darnley had been storing gunpowder for a fireworks display and went downstairs for a smoke. But I think very few people thought that. Was Mary involved in Darnley's murder? Certainly, Murray thought so, and probably every other Protestant in Scotland believed it. Mary observed her 40 days of mourning for her husband, but the murmurs only got worse, and they involved Bothwell. Mary seemed to ignore the rising agitation, but she went out riding on April 23rd, 1567, with a few people. And while she was out, somehow Bothwell knew where she was going and brought 800 of his followers, and they took her to Dunbar Castle. Remember that romantic place? For the night where it was given out. She was raped by Bothwell. In case you are wondering, as well you might, how the rape became known, a poster was posted 4 days later in Aberdeen for support of the Queen because she had been ravished by the Earl of Bothwell. Any questions, Greg?
No, so
No?
far I don't see any questions. Let me see. No.
Okay. Mary required no support. Custom was in those days that you married your rapist. And she did that on May 15th, again while wearing mourning. But the opposition was gathering. Things came to a head on June 15th when the combined forces of the Earls faced Mary and Bothwell's men on Carberry Hill. Outnumbered, Bothwell realized the jig was up, and true to field, he deserted Mary and rode off the field, scuttling off to Denmark in poetic justice. In his haste to prepare for a battle and the expectation that he'd win it, he hadn't taken the trouble to prepare the proper papers for international travel. Yes, they had them in those days. When he attempted to land, he was taken into custody. It happened that it was the hometown of Alençon, his abandoned wife. She immediately sued for recovery of her dowry and was given his ship. Bothwell remained in prison pending extradition to England, where he was wanted for the murder of Darnley. Diplomatic negotiations were slow, possibly on purpose, and Bothwell, now insane, was chained to a pillar, and he died in prison 10 years later. Okay. Abandoned, the queen was taken prisoner, reviled as a whore and a murderess. She was dragged off to the isolation of Lochleven in Castle Island, where she miscarried twins, Lord knows whose, and abdicated the throne on July 24th. And I think I love to show architectural slides because they do give a feeling that here we have Lochleven Castle. What's the noise? Is someone unmuted that I? Okay. Lochleven Castle, and there we have the plain. Things were sometimes castles, and sometimes they were palaces. And when they're castles, they're fortresses, and this certainly was, and that's why she was cooped up there. Okay. Mary's son James, all this while back in Stirling Castle, would need a regent, and all the nobles contended for the position. The Earl of Moray was not that popular, despite everything, for the position. He had been a little bit too autocratic, and a couple of nobles helped Mary to escape in July of 1568. Those of the populace still loyal to her despite the scandals took up arms, but Moray crushed them in a battle near Glasgow. Mary escaped from the carnage, this time to England, where she was promptly imprisoned by Elizabeth. She had lots of time for embroidery, and this is one of hers. I keep wondering why these people who were history, made history, knew so much, would spend their last years of life doing things like embroidery instead of writing their memoirs and kind of letting us in on everything that happened. Marie Antoinette did the same thing. In France, I looked at an enormous hooked rug, and that's what she produced. Of course, she was a lightweight, but Mary, Queen of Scots, was actually an intelligent woman. I'm sure, that all the spies probably went over all the stitches to see if they could find a message in this. But anyhow, that was Mary, and we will return to her, yes. Okay. So, back to Elizabeth. For Elizabeth, time had passed, and she was getting older and less fertile, even as queens must do. At one point, she had exclaimed, when Mary gave birth, that Mary had an heir and she didn't. And she cried, "I am a barren stock." Well, at this point, how would the Virgin Queen know that? Just pointing that out. The pressure for marriage continued. Should she marry a prince of Sweden, Denmark, Austria? All had proposed to her. One suit prospered, though, that of Francois, Duke of Alençon. Now, Francois was the brother of our first Francois. He was the youngest son of Catherine de' Medici, and he was born in 55 with a slightly deformed spine, the youngest of the four, and given the name Hercule. But when his brother died, he took his name to honor him at his confirmation. Francois was succeeded by his brothers Charles IX and Henri III. And during their reigns, Francois became a champion, you can imagine, of the Protestant cause in the Netherlands. And here we have Francois, Duke of Alençon. And you know what? He's got really kind of a live face. I like the guy. And of course, let us get back to Elizabeth. Francois and entry into the marital stakes came as a fortuitous moment. The grand affair or relationship between, if you prefer, between Elizabeth and Leicester hit a slight bump in the road, though Elizabeth didn't know it yet. In 1576, Leicester had sneakily married one of Elizabeth's ladies in waiting, Lettice Knowles, Knollys, and Lettice, Lettice, the widow of the first Earl of Essex. And by the way, mother of the second Earl, Robert Devereux. Lettice was wearing what was euphemistically described as a loose gown at the wedding and gave birth to Leicester's child a few months later. Leicester had engaged in love affairs in the past, including a long-term relationship with Douglas Sheffield, who was female, by the way, and fathered a son by her, whom he was much devoted all his life. Elizabeth knew about that, and she wasn't upset much, but marriage was something else. And I think I might have Lettice here. And yes, I think there she is. In 1578, Francois' envoy, Jean de Seigneur, arrived. He knew all about Leicester's marriage. Everyone in court, with one exception, knew of it. And Seigneur, ecstatic at his chance to discredit Francois' rival, told Elizabeth. Can you imagine everyone in court secretly laughing at her and her monstrous betrayal by the man she trusted most? She had a magnitude 10 temper tantrum. She humiliated Leicester openly before imprisoning him briefly and banished Lettice from court. Francois actually came to England. He was the only one of the foreign suitors who was brave enough to do so. Most of them were scared that Mary's supporters would kill them. And whether to spite Leicester or for diplomatic reasons, she warmly encouraged his attentions, so much so that Leicester publicly asked her if she were still a maid. Either that was play acting to mislead the court, and they weren't, or it was sarcasm, because everybody knew she wasn't. She had, in a fit of jealousy, that was the time of the Baron Stock comments, which did imply that she tried. In any case, Francois and Elizabeth danced and laughed and generally acted like two teenage lovebirds. The 22-year-old Francois gave her a jewel in the shape of a frog. She nicknamed him her frog, and that's supposedly why the English called the French frogs ever since. In return, he requested a loan of a mere 300,000 ducats, which is about $8 million in today's dollars, practically nothing, to pursue his ambitions in the Netherlands against Spain. Elizabeth had no problem with this. As long as Francois was successful, she was happy to supply the cash. Her counselors worked, most of them unwilling to, despite hefty bribes from de Seigneur, on the marriage contract. Francois' support of the Protestant cause told in his favor, counterbalancing his own Catholic religion, which he had never fully abandoned. On the other hand, Francois wanted a lot, money, lots of it, the title of king, an English fort to be garrisoned by French soldiers, and Puritans were gathering strength in England, and for them, anything French was the devil incarnate. The marriage would not even guarantee a French alliance because Francois did not get along all that well, to put it mildly, with the rest of his royal family, except for his sister Margot, who was another black sheep. And I believe at this time still married to Henri IV, who was, as we know, a Protestant. Meanwhile, Francois, strengthened by another 30,000 pounds from Elizabeth, returned to France to take the field against the Spaniards at Cambrai, where his forces were triumphant. He was declared ruler of the Netherlands, and enveloped in glory, he returned to his wooing, and Elizabeth returned to vacillation. At last, one day, while she was walking in the garden with Francois, the French ambassador pressed her for an answer. In reply, Elizabeth leaned over, kissed Francois on the mouth, and slipped a ring from her finger onto his. Francois reciprocated with a ring of his. It was, in fact, a pledge of marriage, and she announced her intention to the court that very day. Once sure of her success, however, Francois intensified his demands. Both parties began negotiation fiercely. She wanted Calais. He was after money, yet more money. He had little success to show for it after Cambrai. She started to make excuses, and he ended by threatening her, a major error. At last, he made an ultimatum, and when it was ignored, he sailed away, February 1583. She wrote a poem on his departure, and then we'll read it to you. It's nice to have somebody's original words, and there are many of Elizabeth's, but let's be content with these. I grieve and dare not show my discontent. I love and yet am forced to seem to hate. I do, yet dare not say I ever meant. I seem stark mute, but inwardly do prate. I am, and not. I freeze and yet am burned, since from another self I turned. My care is like my shadow. The sun follows me, flying, flies when I pursue it, stands and lies by me, doth what I have done. His too familiar care doth make me rue it. No means I find to rid him from my breast, till by the end of things it be suppressed. Some gentler passions slide into my mind, for I am soft and made of melting snow. Or be more cruel, love, and so be kind. Let me or float or sink, be high or low, or let me live with some more sweet content, or die and so forget what love e'er meant. Now, the book from which I took this poem says it was written about Francois. I think it might easily have also been written about Leicester, and you're, of course, free to make up your own minds. There is a sad little coda to the Lettuce Knowles incident. She was the mother of Robert de Vere, Earl of Essex, who happened to be Elizabeth's last love, 32 years younger than she, which is, of course, totally their business, but vastly immature, which was everybody's business in that business. She got mad at him one day, refused to renew some lease he had on a farm, and he raised a rebellion to depose her. It was easily dealt with. And of course, the opera by Donizetti. And we have, I believe, Essex. Yes, he was Essex. Okay, outside the cloistered world of the English court, changes were taking place throughout England and the world. The Puritans have become a major influence in England. Their black coats a silent rebuke to the finery and jewels of Elizabeth's milieu. Some rebukes were not so silent. A Puritan had published a scurrilous rebuke of the Queen for considering marriage with Francois. He had his hand chopped off. There was also a revival of Catholicism as the Counter-Reformation gathered strength. Priests were hanged, drawn, and quartered, not so many as dying in the Protestant victims of Mary Tudor, but enough to inflame the resistance to the Anglican Church, with Elizabeth, of course, at its titular head. Along with that came a quickening of the plots involving her murder and replacement with Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth began to take precautions when she went outdoors. Developments in the New World affected the balance of power in the Old. Money was to be made, lots of it, in piracy and the slave trade. In both of these, Elizabeth was heavily invested. She was no angel, nobody could afford to be at that time, and from which she profited. The English treasury was at a low from foreign wars and her expensive favorites, including Francois Leicester's and others. A nagging problem was what to do about her cousin Mary. There had been a couple of unsuccessful plots to spring her from Fotheringay and maybe assassinate Elizabeth. But Elizabeth had always been reluctant to have her killed, which would have been the simplest way to nullify any threat she might have posed. The given reason for this was that killing an anointed monarch would have set a bad precedent. Now, if you believe Shakespeare, that boat had already sailed with Richard II. So why had this obvious solution taken so long to implement? Why now? There were obviously other considerations. Philip of Spain might come to Mary's aid, but there was enough piracy against his treasure fleet to bring on the Armada, Mary or no Mary. As for France, by 1586, Catherine de' Medici was almost dead, and her influence had greatly lessened. France's king was Henri III. He wanted peace. He couldn't afford war. And his successor, but I honestly believe he wanted peace. His successor would be Francois, the French champion of the Protestant cause in the lowlands. But maybe that was a little bit too much for him. And after that, Henri of Navarre. Neither were likely to invade England. Finally, Elizabeth, and Henri III, by the way, he liked Henri IV. They were friends. Finally, Elizabeth, still grieving her last suitor and others on whom she had depended for friendship and assistance in her reign, was beginning to face her own mortality. Leaving Mary alive to assume the throne would ensure that England would once be torn apart. A campaign 20 years before had aimed at discrediting Mary by accusing her of Darnley's murder and involved the so-called casket letters, which included passionate episodes of Bothwell and love poetry written before the fatal explosion. They may have been forgeries, they may not, and to this day, nobody's quite sure. And of course, one biography that's pro-Elizabeth will say they were, and then you read the next one, and then they weren't. And so again, you can have your own choice. But the Babington Plot was different. In 1586, the head of Elizabeth's intelligence service, Francis Walsingham, had planted a spy inside Chartley Castle, where Mary was currently entombed. Coded letters from Babington were intercepted by the spy, passed to Walsingham, who gave them to the code breaker, Thomas Phillips, to decipher. Although the code was complex, it was an easy job because the spy found the code book, which was sent to her from France, and copied it. And I think, let's see what we have. Oh, that's Walsingham, the spy master. And this one is Anthony Babington. I don't think the artist was a fan of his. Okay. Although the code was complex, once you have the code book, it's a piece of cake. So what did he do? He intercepted a letter that was sent from Babington to Mary, and he added a paragraph to it, good handwriting skills, asking for Mary's reply to ensure that she was receiving the correspondence and that she gave consent to the plans, which involved her escape, the murder of Elizabeth, and the Spanish invasion. She complied using her French code book in the illusion that the correspondence was secure. Now Walsingham had everything he needed. She was tried, convicted, and executed on February 8th, 1587. In 1588, Philip sent the Invincible Armada, and we all know what happened to that. Elizabeth died in 1603. And here's a contemporary portrait of Elizabeth in her last years. And by the way, this over here is Holyrood Castle, which is where Mary would have loved. And that is all I have for you. Hi, Greg.
Yeah. Hi. All right. So I don't know. Should I
Yes, ask your questions.
unlock everybody, unmute? I don't know.
Whatever
Or
you think is best. You can always mute them all again.
yeah, I guess. Okay. Let me. Okay. So far, thank you from Fradel Feld. Or just put your. The reason we mute everyone is because sometimes we get bombed. So that's why we're very careful about that. We don't want that accident. So, but you can still put your questions or comments in the chat, and I'll read it. Thank you. Interesting presentation from Karen. Okay, so let's see. There is just thank you, Heather from Heather. No questions, huh?
No. Okay, well, I'll turn it over to you and I will go and try to find something to soothe my throat. Okay?
Sure, sure. Okay, thank you so much. You had some very interesting background information from Laura Carroll, Nicole M, and Boris. Thank you for great presentation. So far, it's just thank yous, but no questions. Go ahead, take your drink. We'll see if any other anything else
Okay.
comes along. So
Yeah, I'm going to leave.
so you leaving that
Yeah.
for good? Okay, then that will probably end the conversation. All right, thank you very much for coming, and I guess this is the end of this presentation. All right. Okay.
All
Take
right.
care. Goodbye,
You too.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Yeah, you can end.